Kim Evans' film shows this search through the eyes of a young English artist working in Paris, whose curiosity about Chagall is aroused when he discovers the studio he's working in once belonged to the painter, and he begins to look at the work he did there.
La Ruche is a strange place. The startling round building and its surrounding studios are hidden behind tall trees in a little passage in the back streets of Montparnasse. Probably the high point in its history was the period just before the First World War, when Chagall was one of a group of artists and writers who worked or visited here. Maybe that accounts for the strange feel La Ruche has. It's casual, chaotic even, but there's a kind of formality too, a sense of having to live up to all the past masters who are still here somehow. The 3 floors of tiny studios open off corridors around the central stairwell. It really is a beehive. Little cells made of wood, permeated with the smell of oil paint. People lock themselves away to work, but you're never really alone at La Ruche. You can always hear the other artists coming and going, talking, arguing, laughing. But the artist whose presence I feel most strongly is Chagall. Many people think the pictures from his La Ruche days are the best things he ever did. The paintings intrigued me. They weren't like anybody else's work. I wanted to find out how Chagall came to paint like that, and why. The book that told me most about Chagall was his autobiography, My Life. He wrote it when he was only 35 and still struggling and poor. It is as fantastic and mysterious as his paintings, and told me little of the facts of his life, but a lot about the man. Chagall said it had the same meaning as a painted surface, and it is a series of images, individual and highly coloured. It's Chagall's own fantasy. The one thing we do know is that Mark Chagall, today the grand old man of French painting, started life in a totally different world. He was born Moishe Siegel, a poor Jew, in Vitebsk, a small town in the Russian provinces, in 1887. His father was a fish porter, and his mother ran a small shop. I soon realized that if I was to understand anything at all about Chagall, I had to go back to his birth. As Chagall chooses to describe it, it was a pretty dramatic event.
Just at the moment of my birth, in a little cottage near the road on the outskirts of Vitebsk, a great fire broke out behind the prison. The town was in flames, the quarter of the poor Jews. They carried the bed and mattress, the mother and the baby at her feet to a safe place at the other end of the town. But first of all, I was stillborn. I didn't want to live. Imagine. A little white bubble that doesn't want to live, as though it were stuffed with Chagall paintings. They pricked it with needles and plunged it into a bucket of water. Finally, it made a feeble whimper. But to all intents and purposes, I was stillborn. I trust the psychologists won't draw any unseemly conclusion from this.
In fact, as far as I could establish fact, Chagall's early life in Vitebsk must have been pretty quiet. Yet that very ordinary Russian town and its people have appeared in his paintings ever since.
Here is my soul. Look for me here. Here are my pictures, my roots. Sadness, sadness. In the evening, and all the children at home, Papa dozed over the table. The lamp rested, and the chairs grew bored. Outside, you could hardly tell where the sky was, or where nature had vanished. Every Saturday, my Uncle Neusch put on a talit, any old talit, and read the Bible aloud. He also played the violin, like a shoemaker. I smile, trying out his violin, jumping in his pockets, on his nose. He buzzes like a fly. My head flies softly by itself around the room. This picture, you can break it down, is a construction of triangles. I wanted a rhythm. The footprints in the snow, the three superimposed heads at the bottom to the left, the steps of the houses are so many repetitions, as in the music of Stravinsky.
Restrictions on the movement of the Jews in Tsarist Russia forced them into tight-knit communities. And those communities must have been very oppressive. Maybe this is why Chagall uses those images of his family over and over again. He can't resolve his feelings about them. He loves them, and at the same time he hates the narrowness, the stifling closeness of life in a ghetto in a Russian backwater. He uses painting to try and remake that life, to turn its restrictions into something positive. He must have felt that the only way he could survive and succeed was to separate himself from this environment. Most adolescents are self-absorbed, but Chagall seems to have been especially determined to manufacture an identity, an image.
My closest friends caught me more than once in front of the glass. As a matter of fact, I was studying myself, thinking of the difficulties I should have if I ever wanted to paint my portrait. But there was a touch of admiration in it. Why not? I admit.
Chagall's ambition to be a painter must have seemed as ridiculous to his family as wanting to be the Tsar. But his mind was made up. In 1907, he cut himself off from his home and went to St. Petersburg to try to get into an art school. As a Jew, he needed a special... He was alone and had almost no money. It must have taken real courage, especially as this was Chagall's first contact with the art establishment.
As soon as I arrived in the capital, I went to take the entrance examination for Baron Steglitz's school. Everything alarmed me. Studies, copying those long plaster decorations that looked like things in a shop. I thought, these decorations were deliberately chosen to frighten you, to put the Jewish students off, prevent them getting the vital permit. Alas, my suspicion was right. I failed the examination. I got no recommendation, no grant. Nothing could be done about it. I had to enroll in an easier school, the one run by the Society for the Protection of the Arts, where I went straight into the third year without an examination. What did I do there? I couldn't tell you. numerous plaster heads of Greek and Roman citizens projected from every corner, and I, poor provincial, had to pore over the wretched nostrils of Alexander of Macedon or some other plaster idiot. Sometimes I walked up to those noses and punched them. And from the back of the room, I stood and stared at the dusty breasts of Venus.
So, St. Petersburg turned out to be just another form of repression, not the liberal education he'd hoped for. Now his dreams turned towards the European capital of art, Paris. Before long, he scraped up the means to get there. In Paris, he found a new style. Part of the reason for that lay in the city itself.
I had little to do with schools and teachers. I found them in the city itself, at every step, in everything. Around the passerby hovered this astonishing freedom light, which I have never seen elsewhere. This light passed easily onto the canvases of the great French masters and was reborn in art.
But it wasn't just the light and the landscape that showed Chagall the way forward. Paris at that time was the hothouse of 20th century painting. In 1910, when Chagall arrived, the revolution in ways of seeing and painting was in full swing. Artists were experimenting with new theories and techniques designed to capture the essence of the subject, not just its surface. What that essence might be, form, colour, symbol, depended on the artist and the movement he followed. Chagall seems to have been bewitched by all of it.
I arrived in Paris as though driven by fate. I aspired to see with my own eyes what I had heard of from so far away. This revolution of the eye.
Chagall certainly fell on his feet when he came to live at La Ruche. He was surrounded by many of the best artists and writers of the day. Matisse, Modigliani, Léger and Apollinaire all worked or visited here. The sudden blitz of new ideas he was exposed to had a radical effect on Chagall's own painting. You can see it clearly in what I think is one of his best works from this time, The Artist with Seven Fingers. Chagall is playing with surfaces in a cubist way, like Picasso or Braque. But copying it, I'm puzzled as to exactly what Chagall thought he was doing. The Russian decoration seems to work against the Cubist ideas. And what about the seven fingers?
Why seven fingers? To introduce another construction, a fantastic element alongside the realistic ones. The dissonance adds to the psychic effect.
I don't agree. The way Chagall uses the new French ideas he's picked up alongside the old Russian elements makes me wonder if he really understood what this revolution of the eye was all about. Surely you can't use it just as a kind of decorative technique. It has to be a completely new way of seeing. But I have to admit that Chagall's painting is effective. Was his single-mindedness inspired, or just blind?
To me, a painting is a large surface covered with objects represented in a certain order. For example, the headless woman with a pail of milk, who appears in one of my canvases done in 1910. If I had the idea of separating her head from her body, it is because I needed an empty space right at that spot.
I'm not really convinced by this, and I don't think it's surprising that in 1911 they weren't convinced either. At that time, the only way to get your work across was to have it shown in the big salons. In the context of most of the work displayed there, Chagall's pictures must have seemed very confusing, and his comments about them pure evasion. He found it hard to break into the world of the Paris salons. Some of the judges even found his work pornographic. In 1914, Chagall was given the chance of an exhibition in Berlin, and he jumped at it. While he was there, the First World War broke out, and political events became as convulsed as the most radical modern painting.
People often ask me why I painted so many cows, but it seemed that the cow was conducting world politics at that time. Cubism chopped her up, Expressionism twisted her, and suddenly in the East, those forebodings were fulfilled. It seemed that I carried the first signs of that stormy period with me to Berlin, where I went to see my exhibition. Pictures swelled the Potsdamer Straße while cannon were being loaded nearby. Can we help it if we can only see the world events through canvas, paint, and painting materials, thickening and vibrating like poisonous gases? Europe goes to war. Picasso, no more Cubism. Who cares about Serbia? Attack all those barefoot peasants. Set Russia afire, and all of us with her.
I discovered Chagall went back to Russia for a visit, but while he was broke out and he got swept up in the fortunes of his homeland. For a few months, there was a carnival feel in the air. Lenin and the Bolshevik government seemed to signal a bright new age. Restrictions on the Jews were abolished overnight. Chagall was even a commissar for the arts for a short time. I think the work he did at that time had real originality and energy. But the party didn't last long. Soon the communist leaders were demanding art that served politics. Propaganda in a direct form that everyone could understand. I can see why they didn't think Chagall's work fitted the bill. While he was back in Russia, Chagall married his old sweetheart, Bella Rosenfeld, the daughter of a prosperous Vitebsk jeweler. According to Chagall, she was a crucial source of ideas for him, both as a subject and as a critic.
I only had to open my window and the air, love, and flowers entered with her. She has long been flying over my canvases, guiding my art. I never complete a picture or an engraving without asking for her, yes or no.
He went on painting Bella for more than 30 years. Her face still dominates his work, even after her death in 1944. Bella was important to me too, because it was she, rather than any art critic, who helped me to understand Chagall's imagination in action. This is how she described his painting The Birthday, done at the time of their marriage in 1915.
Don't move, you said. Stay just like that. I was still holding the flowers. I wanted to put them in water before they died. But I soon forgot all about them. You dashed at the canvas with such energy it shook the easel. You plunged the brushes into the paint so fast that red and blue, black and white flew through the air. They swept me with them. I suddenly felt as if I were taking off. You too were poised on one leg as if the little room could no longer contain you. You soared up to the ceiling. Your head turned down to mine and turned mine up to you, brushing against my ear and whispering something. Then together we floated up above the room with all its finery and flew. Oh, it's very good. We'll call it The Birthday.
Unfortunately, life couldn't always be lived on that level. Within a few years, their daughter Ida was born, and the early days of revolutionary freedom in Russia gave way to bureaucratic interference. Eventually, Chagall couldn't stand it any longer, and he left his homeland forever. It was 1922, the year Chagall wrote his autobiography. He clearly realized that a chapter had ended. Chagall returned to Paris with his wife and baby, and there his dreams of fame and fortune quickly came true. The image of the charming, fashionable painter he'd invented for himself in his autobiography was now a reality. He didn't feel the need to transform his life by writing about it anymore. But I was sure there was still a lot more to find out about Chagall. I decided to concentrate on the work itself and see where that led me. Although Chagall never lived in Russia again, his imagination has never let go of it. I could see that strongly in his designs for the theatre. It was a Russian folktale that led to a new development in his work. In 1942, he designed the sets and costumes for Massine's Russian ballet Alieko, based on Pushkin's poem The Gypsies. Chagall was dedicated but autocratic. He insisted on absolute control over every aspect of scenery, props, and costume so that he could create a complete fantasy. When it opened in New York, the ballet was a big success, although one critic remarked,
It is Chagall who emerges as the hero of the evening. He has designed and painted with his own hand 4 superb backdrops, which are not actually good stage settings at all, but are wonderful works of art. So exciting are they that one wishes all those people would quit getting in front of them.
Over the years, Chagall has designed a lot of other productions. It's easy to see that the designs are full of excitement. But I can also see why Chagall continued to be criticized for stealing the show. But there's one project where I felt Chagall clearly worked hard to design something that would complement its surroundings rather than dominate them.
In the early 60s, the Minister for the Arts, Monsieur André Malraux, proposed that I paint a new ceiling for the Paris Opera. I was disconcerted, touched, and moved. Disconcerted because I'm afraid of commissions, though inwardly I dream of monumental works, and touched by the confidence and vision of André Malraux. Certain opinions only reinforce my doubts. Until the day when my wife said, "Try to do a few rough sketches and you'll see." I thought of the opera as a whole. Up there, I wanted to reflect, as in a mirror, the clustered dreams, the creations of the actors and musicians, to sing like a bird, to pay homage to the great composers of operas and ballets.
The ceiling had a grand unveiling on September the 23rd, 1964. It's an extraordinary marriage of architecture and painting. But Chagall certainly got it right this time. To try and find out more about the painter Chagall had become, I went down to the south of France, where he's lived since 1949. At that time, this little strip of coast between Nice and Cannes must have been much less crowded and even more beautiful than it is today. I could understand why so many painters were drawn here: Matisse, Picasso, and Dufy, as well as Chagall. Today, Chagall, who lives in the village of Saint-Paul-de-Vence with his second wife Valentina, is the only survivor of that great generation of painters. I have to admit that I'd hoped I'd actually get to meet him here. But even if I didn't, I thought by seeing his home ground and trying to work here myself, I'd get a better idea of how life in the south of France had changed him and fed into his art. The old walled towns here, with their medieval churches, feature strongly in his work. Often they seem to be mirror images of Vitebsk, the small Russian town he left more than 60 years ago. When someone asked Chagall if he thought of himself as a Russian Jewish painter, he replied, "In art there is no nationalism. Russia is still in my heart. But without France, I would not be Chagall." Chagall is 97 now, but until very recently he worked every day. Watching this film of him, shot in 1969, I felt closer to him. I began to understand a bit more about his technique and how his mind was working. Chagall certainly isn't prepared to give you much insight himself. He always refuses to play the game of finding meanings in his work.
For me, it was only a question of resolving a plastic problem, to construct an arabesque in human form with real means, to construct another reality, an architectural sign. I can't help it if for 50 years critics have been looking for more enticing and limited explanations. My reality is elsewhere. If someone sees in my art only this search for pleasure, he's free to do so. Free also to consider how another reality is being involuntarily transformed in forms and colors. But on this point, as on others, I prefer to keep silent.
As it turned out, watching film of Chagall at work and seeing his paintings at the Magd Gallery in St. Paul was the nearest I got to meeting Chagall. I knew that in the end I had to make up my mind about him by looking at the pictures themselves. But all the same, it's frustrating that he's chosen to say so little about his work, and I can see how it has brought accusations from critics that he is mystical or poetic. Obviously, there are those elements in his work, but I think it's wrong to assume that this means he's soft or artistically Sometimes critics have even implied that Chagall put little real thought into his work at all, as if he somehow just tapped into his subconscious. These charges once managed to goad Chagall into replying.
However fantastic or illogical the construction of my pictures may appear, I should be frightened to conceive them by some mixture of automatism. If I put the dead man in the street and the fiddler on the roof in one of my pictures, or if in another one, I Am the Village, I placed a small cow and a milkmaid in the head of a large cow, I did not do it at all by automatism. It is wrong of certain people to be afraid of the word mysticism, giving as they do a too religiously orthodox color. We should strip this term of its obsolete, musty exterior. It should be taken in its high, pure, unblemished form. Mystic. How many times they have thrown this word in my face, just as formerly they scolded me for being literary. But without mysticism, would a single great painting, a single great poem, or even a single great social movement exist in the world?
Chagall has come a long way from Tsarist Russia. Today, he is very much the grand old man of French painting, and over the years, he's been rewarded by the country that he's made his home. He seems to enjoy this role immensely, but I get the impression that he also likes to remember just how far he's come, how he started out as a poor Russian Jew and has gone on to create many large works for public buildings all over the world. In my opinion, Chagall's most successful monumental works are his stained glass windows. When you think of stained glass, the flat jewel-like tapestries of the great cathedral windows of the Middle Ages come to mind. Few modern windows stand out. But I think Chagall has really succeeded in developing a strong new style in this medium. The series of windows representing the 12 tribes of Israel, which he designed for the Hadassah University near Jerusalem, show how Chagall uses each window to explore variations of one color, painting with light. I wanted to know more about how Chagall's windows were designed and made. This film of Chagall working with Charles Mark of the Ciment Workshop gave me many of the answers. Chagall does the initial designs, which show the variations of light and shade and the positions of the colours. These studies form the basis of Mark's work. First, they are translated into life-size drawings, which become the blueprint for the windows. The glass is chosen and tinted to the right shade by coating it with a thin film of colour, which can be treated with acid to vary its intensity. Chagall takes over once again when the panes of glass are mounted, modifying highlights and shadows, scratching, dabbing and rubbing the glass to craft the light shining through it to the shade and intensity he planned. The end results fully realise his designs. I wanted to see some of Chagall's stained glass for myself, so I set off for the museum devoted to his work in Nice. The strength of colour and line in the windows here is so overwhelming that it makes the museum seem like a place of worship, which is just what it is, although not in the usual sense. Chagall has long been interested in the Bible, and this museum is devoted entirely to his religious works.
Since my early youth, I have been fascinated by the Bible. It has always seemed to me, and it seems to me still, that it is the greatest source of poetry of all time. Since then, I have sought this reflection in life and art. The Bible is like an echo of nature, and this secret I have tried to transmit. To my mind, these paintings do not represent the dream of a single people, but of all mankind.
It was through looking at Chagall's religious paintings that I saw the strength of the early work re-emerging. I know that many people only take Chagall's work seriously in his Paris or Russian periods. After that, they think his pictures are sentimental or self-consciously naive. Of course, that side of his work does exist, but I think it is offset by the great tragic paintings where he powerfully combines Christian and Judaic symbols. I was haunted by the paintings prompted in him by suffering, particularly the suffering of the Jews. Strangely, Chagall seems almost surprised by the fact that his heritage has claimed him.
How is it that the air, the soil of Vitebsk, my native town, the thousands of years of the diaspora, find themselves mixed with the air and soil of Jerusalem? It seems to me that your tragic and heroic resistance movements in the ghettos have become mixed with my flowers, my beasts, my fiery colors.
The Holocaust of the Second World War affected Chagall deeply. He was haunted by guilt because he left France at that time when other painters stayed. In 1950, he wrote a poem to the 80 Jewish artists who were among the millions who had died.
They ask me, "Where were you?" I ran away. They were taken to the death baths, where they got the taste of their sweat. That was when they saw the light of their unpainted pictures. I see. Now they drag themselves along in tatters, barefoot on mute roads, Israel's brothers, Pissarro's and Modigliani's, our brothers, led along by ropes by the sons of Dürer, Cranach and Holbein, being led to death in the crematoriums. How can I, how shall I shed tears? They were long since soaked in salt from my eyes. They were dried with scorn, so that I should lose my last hope. I stand in the desert before piles of slippers, clothes, ash, and rubbish, murmuring out a single Kaddish. As I stand thus, there descend to me from my pictures the painted David with his lyre in his hand. He wants to help me weep and play chapters of Psalms. After him descends our Moses, saying, "Do not fear anyone." He says that you should be quiet until he carves out new tablets for a new world.
I find it quite hard to square this kind of perception, this rawness, with the charming scenes of landscapes and lovers Chagall has gone on producing to this day. There doesn't seem to be the remotest connection between the two visions. But reading about Chagall's work, I came across one critic, Boris Aronson, who seems to have found the connection. He too was a painter, a Russian and a Jew.
Chagall is a storyteller. He doesn't make literature, he is a painter. A real painter, but he is a storyteller as a painter and a painter as a storyteller. But then he began to exploit it. He is like a woman who is charming. Nobody knows why she is charming. It's beyond explanation. Then, when everybody tells her she's charming, she begins to use it, consciously. And when charm becomes a system, the magic is gone. That is late Chagall.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. But with Chagall, it's so difficult to be sure. He never really reveals himself in his work. He's a man of masks. He hides behind his paintings like a clown behind his makeup. So it seemed right that the last place I went to look for Chagall was the circus. It's an image which has haunted his work for 3/4 of a century. Traveling acrobats were probably the first artists he ever saw as a child in Russia. Later, when he lived in Paris, he used to go to the circus every week.
For me, the circus is a magical spectacle that goes by and dissolves like a world. There is a restless circus, a profound circus. These clowns, these riders, these acrobats have taken up residence in my visions. Why? Why am I moved by their makeup and expressions? With them, I approach other horizons.
I can see why the circus fascinates Chagall. It has the same contradictions you find in his work. Pathos and comedy, seaminess and beauty, vulgarity and magic. If you analyze the circus too much, you lose that magic. And in the end, it's the same with Chagall.
Mine alone is the country of my soul. I enter it without a passport. I'm at home there. It sees my sadness and my solitude. But there are no houses there. They were destroyed in my childhood. Their tenants fly through the air looking for a home. They live in my soul. There was a time when I had two heads. There was a time when these two faces were covered with the dew of love and melted like a rose's perfume. Now it seems to me that even as I draw back, I advance towards a vast door. Behind it, walls lie stretched out, muffled thunderclaps and broken shafts of lightning sleep. Mine alone is the country of my soul.